to each other. Because if you want to stop that happening, you need something alongside the legislation on day one to address those issues. And those are issues about how communities relate to each other. It's issues about relationship building, about actively challenging barriers. And we're afraid that without those things happening simultaneously, what will happen is that the legislation will move the problem. That some people will be deterred by it and they will change their behaviour, and other people won't. And we will see the same amount of problem just sitting somewhere else. So absolutely we think that we need to take action to fix the problem, and legislation can help with that. But if those things happen as a package.
Okay, thank you. What I was also going to ask was, Professor Devine mentioned that the legislation will at least be controversial. I don't doubt that at all. I think actually on such a subject it's always going to be controversial. And I noticed that in the Catholic Church's submission by John Deighan, they had a particular issue with the fact that the bill was being widened out. And I think in Part 1, subsection 4, colour, race, nationality, etc., etc. The chances are, I think, from your submission, it was really only a couple of categories that you had an issue with, rather than all 7 that are there. But on the Church of Scotland submission, they, if I got this right, they almost welcomed the fact that it was being extended, or that it could be extended. Does that not present a difficulty then on making the legislation and making the law? Do we not just have to accept then that, you know, some people are going to be offended, some people are going to want it more narrow, some people are going to want it broadened, and you know, is that not just part of the legislation process really, or does it not need to be an acceptance that that's part of the legislation process?
And I think that was why the first time that we had this conversation with the committee, we emphasised consultation, because I think we should be seeking for some balance and to actually identify who is welcoming things and why, and whether that's a good idea and the opposite. And
I got this right, you think it should be widened to further...
Yes, our discussion was that there are other things that happen at football games, and it is appropriate, if you're going to legislate for football games, you should include those other things as well.
And Mr. Deighan?
Well, no, I mean, we've seen the legislation should be necessary, and it's identifying what is the problem that is bringing this legislation into existence. So it's identifying a problem with the widening of the categories. It was not just a widening of categories, but an introduction of categories that to be honest, we just didn't understand whether there was a problem in those. You know, the one, again, this brings us into an area where we're accused of offending people for our views on this, but it's following an understanding of human nature that we do not agree with. A belief that human nature is not defined as male and female. Now, that's bringing that into a bill to deal with bigotry, and we just thought that was out of place, that those issues have been dealt with in the Equality Act.
On that.
To direct you, the bill is not a bigotry bill, it's offensive behaviour.
Yeah.
So the bill, in its purpose, concerning offensive behaviour in relation to certain football matches, so it's not a sectarian bill. Although that's been the main focus, but it's not.
But that was our understanding of why it had come to be.
I think what was interesting was, I don't know if you've had the chance to see Tim Hopkins' submission from the Equality Network, and again, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's really the sexual orientation and transgender identity categories that you're taking issue with. And his opinion was that at football matches they've heard expressions, you know, from the crowd. I think in his submission, the words, for example, faggot, that were used. And I don't imagine that would apply to members of the Catholic Church. I mean, if in your submission you make the point that you believe understanding of human sexuality, which is rejected by the Catholic Church and which is contrary to natural law, that's a very tactful way, I suppose you could argue, is a tactful way of putting it. What you would, I'd imagine, condemn is the use of inflammatory language, which is perhaps...
Well, as I say, we do object to mistreatment, disorder, for whatever the grounds are. The reason we raise that concern is because the bill, which it was explained to us by the Minister when they introduced it, that this was dealing with the problem of sectarianism at football matches. I realise, and of course, from the name of the bill and from what it deals with, it is much wider than that. So by doing that, it takes us into a much broader area. In that broader area, all we would say is, do we understand why we're doing that? Do we understand why there are 5 different forms of transgender identity? That's all we're saying in that. That's an area that needs to be explored in quite some detail, and there is a philosophy behind that. Why Why is that the case? That, I mean, have we explored that in this bill, that we need 5 forms of transgender identity to be defined as a protected characteristic? I don't know, maybe there is evidence to show that, but we certainly were not made aware of that. We were made aware that this was a bill being brought in because of the sectarianism, which we would understand as bigotry at football matches, which was causing disorder.
I thought your point about including in a line of provisions with Article 9 and 10 of ECHR was well made in the submission.
Thanks.
I'm moving on to John Finney, please, followed by Graham.
Hums has covered 90%. I was going to direct questions of that nature to you, Mr Deighan, and I think it is right to say that that particular section where you talk about the wide ambits of the provisions will have been found deeply offensive by some people, and I think we have to accept that is the case. Could I ask you in relation to what I thought was a very unusual phrase they used in the second paragraph? We are unclear as to the source of the categories, that's okay. Unaware of individuals who may define themselves as such being specifically targeted for mistreatment. Now, hypothetically, if someone within either of these two categories, that's transgender or transsexualism, if we could give you specific examples, would you condemn that?
Would we condemn people being mistreated for those reasons? Yes, of course.
Can I ask you in relation to, and this may be, again, nothing to do, we also had a submission from the Scottish Catholic Observer. I don't know if you would be able to speak to that submission or not.
Well, you can certainly try if you want, but I'm not speaking on their behalf. If the issue is of interest, but I'm not speaking on their behalf. No.
It was a submission from the editor, which took the form of a brief preamble followed by an article. And in the article, it talked about a deliberate distortion of the truth. I don't know if you've seen this submission, have you?
Sorry, I haven't.
No. Well, it would be unfair. I was going to say it would be unfair to ask.
It's unfair without the article in front of you and just a bit quoted. So I think if you wish, as I've said to previous panels, if there's any you want to add later, any comment on other evidence, whether or not it's submitted by yourself, please feel free to write to the committee. That's your conclusion.
Concluded. Thank you very much.
Graham.
Professor Devine mentioned in an earlier part of his submission a view that he had about lack of enforcement and prosecution of the current legislation. Can you give us some indication of why you say that, what evidence you base that on?
You listen to football matches on the television? Did you see the recent Scottish, was it League Cup final or some game involving 2 opposite members of the old firm? 25 to 30,000 people were committing a collective and brazen act of sectarian breach of the peace because of the song that they were singing. That was the song condemned by UEFA and the song for which one of the 2 football clubs involved was punished and humiliated before Europe. That's just one example, but there are many others.
And do you identify that because of the sheer problem that's presented in dealing with a crowd of that size, or is it something that for years has been ongoing and ignored?
Well, I think there's been a culture of toleration. That's just the way things are. We now have different expectations, partly because the attention of the world is on us. CNN were in the country 2 days ago, may well have interviewed members of this committee, but their report will go to 200 countries over the next couple of weeks. Because the process is still ongoing in terms of the delivery of the bill, the world is still very interested in this. So that international factor has been relevant. But the more interesting thing to me is there must be, in terms of modern systems of communication and CCTV and other methodologies, the police obviously cannot imprison half of a fan base at a major football match, but they can at least make exemplars of some of them, which may then have the desired effect. In my view, the heart of this committee's operation, and I know that it's almost irrelevant, perhaps, to your deliberations, is to ensure that the forces of law and order implement the existing legislation. Because, I mean, John Deighan is absolutely right. I think it follows as night follows day. What has triggered this process was concerns about sectarianism in Scotland, not concerns about racism. There is legislation for that already. Not concerns about people insulting individuals because of their disability. I think from the historian's point of view, one of the questions we would love to ask the former Lord Advocate and the present Lord Advocate, now previously the Solicitor General, is why did they widen this canvas in this analytical way? If the problem was specified, universally specified, as rooted in the sectarian issue, why has the bill been expanded to this degree? And expanded in a way which will cause enormous problems in legal enforcement.
Certainly, I'm sure the committee will put that. We're not doing a formal stage 1 report. You know, that was dealt with when there was going to be emergency legislation, which we disapproved of collectively. But we will be doing a report to Parliament treated like a quasi-stage 1 report. So these issues will be put. And I can assure you that one of the questions that this committee, I think, will put, I can't assure you by, well, is it necessary? I mean, we've already examined other means of enforcement, either through existing legislation or, in fact, just protocols. And
I plead with the committee to take that issue that you've just identified, Convener. And it's tremendous that this process is ongoing. What a disaster it would have been if this legislation had been implemented immediately in the short time frame originally envisaged. I think you've got to, in my view, tackle this issue head on and not necessarily simply go through the paragraphs of the legislation. Is the legislation really necessary? Could it be counterproductive? And what is the coverage, if you like, of the existing legislation, specifically in relation to the problem identified in 2003?
I think these are certainly legitimate questions that the committee would be asking of the Cabinet, the Minister and the Lord Advocate. Prior even, excellent though your appearance here is, Professor Devine, even prior to your appearance here today, I think these questions were ready in the air for us. I'm
absolutely certain that they must have been, because they are absolutely at the heart of this issue.
I want to, bearing in mind I've got another 11 minutes, so I'm keeping to timetable, and I'm going to take John Lamont first, Hamza, because he's not been in yet. Alison, you're not wanting. I'm looking after you, see. There's only 2 women on this committee, saying some kind of positive discrimination here. But you're not, no positive discrimination. There's too many men in this committee. John.
Thank you, Convener. My question is to Professor Devine. Sort of rewinding slightly, you made reference to the 2003 offences, Professor, and the fact that only 14% of the offences were actually aggravated by sectarian behaviours. Is that correct? Am I
No. Sorry, I communicated that wrongly. What I said was that only 14% of the cases assessed and evaluated and were in relation to events at football matches or outside them. Right. I was trying to refute the assertion, because so much of this process has been based on assertion rather than argument, aka statements with evidence. I was trying to refute the assertion that was made by one of the police officers that this was overwhelmingly a public order problem or an issue related to football matches. Some of the very few pieces of hard evidence we have over that snapshot of 2003, early 2004, refute that analysis.
So in terms of the 86% of other cases which were assessed, do you have any information about the circumstances?
Right. I can give you some of the major conclusions. Most of them, 54%, were in the Glasgow area, 22% were in Lanarkshire, and a substantial minority were in West Lothian. I can consider the reasons why that should be if you're interested in it, because the reasons are historical. Alcohol was a feature in the majority of cases. In 49% of the cases, the police report revealed that the accused was under the influence at the time of the offence. There were twice as many Catholics as Protestant victims examined. 1% of the cases showed Muslims as being the target. 15% of cases arose in the context of marches. In other words, we need the big database of 2003 to 2011 to be confident. and that will appear in public domain in due course. But what it's really saying to us this far, that's not